So everybody, welcome to MapCamp. I'm at home. Obviously, we all are at home. I'm in the marsh. So just in case, because I have 3 internet connections, they're all rubbish. I live in the UK, and so I have to channel bond across the lot. If I suddenly start going silent and not moving, don't worry, just get on without me, and I will try and join them. Okay, so the format today a little bit different. What we got is an hour and a half. We got 3 wonderful speakers. Each speaker is going to talk for 15 minutes, and then we're going to have a discussion between all 3 on what was presented. And you'll get chances to throw in questions. And I see everybody's using the chat. And good morning, everyone. And then we'll just repeat that 3 times. Okay. Now. The order. Oh, the subject today. It's all about, it's not the map, it's the mapping activity that matters. And 3 speakers we've got today. One helped transform the UN Global Data Platform and UK government with G-Cloud. Another is a leading light in the Agile community across Australia. And the third, and certainly not the least, is a digital has done digital transformation across a massive retail. It happens to be a cooperative that gives the hint in the UK. So enough blah 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 from me. I just want to hand over just to the speakers just for a few minutes to introduce themselves, and then we'll get going with the running order. And the running order today is Danielle, and then Kim, and then Mark. So let's introduce in that order. Danielle.
Good morning, everybody. Nice to be here today, and it's really, really sunny where I am.
And Danielle, which one of the 3 are you?
I'm Danielle.
Oh, but are you UN, Lean, or are you the
digital transformation?
Digital transformation across the whole, and it is the cooperative as well, isn't it? Which is like a huge brand within the UK.
It is, yes.
Well, welcome. Real pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us. So next in the running order would be Kim. Hello, Kim.
Hi, Simon. Thank you so much. And yes, it's evening over here in lovely Australia. So I'm very, very happy I didn't have to fly all the way there. It's quite nice to do an online conference. Thank you. And I enjoy doing a lot of stuff working with government and all that sort of thing at the moment. So that's my fun time right now.
And you're obviously the leading light of Agile in Australia. So I've got to say, the travel. I mean, obviously COVID, physical isolation, but lots of social interaction. And I'm with you. I'm not missing the travel. I mean, physically, it was harmful so much, and it's different. It's hey, I've lost weight, I'm getting fitter. I mean, terrible that the disease is, and there are just those few things which certainly once we overcome, I don't want to go back to that dreadful world of travel. Now on that note, and by a process of deduction, it must be the UN and UK Gov. So Mark Craddock.
Yeah, morning everyone. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about my experience of mapping starting back in 2012 all the way through to now. So that includes work at the Houses of Parliament, the Land Registry, the UN, the Cabinet Office, and G-Cloud. So and I've and now moving into kind of like developing training on Wardley mapping.
Thank you, Mark. So we're going to start off. We've got roughly 15 minutes for each speaker to present. Then we'll have the discussion. We repeat it 3 times. And first up, to start and kick off MapCamp 2020 is Danielle. I'm delighted. I mean, Danielle, we've known each other for many years, and Danielle's spoken at MapCamp before. So at this point, I will now finally go quiet and hand over completely to Danielle. Danielle, stage is yours.
Thank you very much. So I'm just going to share my screen because I have a presentation which I would like to step through as I go through this. So bear with me, being first. Hopefully no technical glitches. Okay. So the topic today is around, it's not the map, it's the mapping activity. And I want to share some insights and observations that I've found through doing mapping over the last 5 years, both in my work and outside my work. So why is the act of mapping more valuable than the map itself? Well, you create a really great shared understanding and empathy by punching walls through the organisation. It really brings people together, and the greater the mix of people you have, the richer the experience is going to be. The transparency that maps create, they create real clarity, and decisions are very simplified. Things are or they are not. You can debate various positions of things on the map, but ultimately you have to agree before you leave the room. And the activity I found can be pivoted around a diverse set of problems to solve things at very different scales. So anything from a single product to even a whole organisation. So what's the most vital ingredient? The most vital ingredient I found is that the more diversity of thought, experience and knowledge, the richer the mapping activity, which leads to a higher quality output, which is the map clearly, and a higher value of the outcomes, so some of the insights and the decisions and the direction that you might choose to take. So you can't get all that without doing the right amount of preparation, and I found this the hard way in running mapping activities. So my first tip is to keep it simple and really make it meaningful. And the reason I say this is because mapping can seem quite daunting to people, particularly those who haven't done architecture or maybe not be from a technical background and not used to seeing things that look quite as complex as we see in Wardley maps. So this is something, this is how I think I look sometimes when I'm explaining Wardley mapping to people, because they can be quite daunting and there's lots of different concepts to communicate at the same time. And, you know, there's no simple step-by-step guide. There's lots of elements, you know, you've got doctrine, climatic patterns, even value chains aren't that properly understood. And even the evolution curve is flipped when you walk into a mapping session from when you've just explained to people around the history of mapping and why it is what it is. And then you tend to feel like you've probably said too much and you might have turned a few people off and they've got a bit scared and you know, don't really want to take part in the activity because it feels too complicated. And one of the biggest bits of feedback I've had is that it's come across as too cerebral. Before I'd made some adaptations into how I introduced it into my work. So what I've found that a good way to get around this is to use the reason you're mapping in the first place to design around your workshop. Getting started is the hardest part. Only use the parts that help you get there and no more. You can always add to this later. I find that even if something's quite complex, if people are involved in creating the thing at the very beginning, you can layer on more complexity as time goes on. And remembering that maps are supposed to be living things, so getting one on paper for the first time is an enormous step. So you should be very proud of that, even if it looks very scrappy. The second tip is making it more digestible and removing some time sinks from the conversations. The worst thing to happen is you try and start a Wardley mapping session and people are disagreeing around what's on the axis and what it means, what things on the map mean, what outcome are you looking for. So again, people will start to debate, is it an activity or a technology or a capability? What do the blobs mean? What do the lines mean? Do we need a key? Do we need a precise scale on the axes? We work with people who sometimes want a lot of precision. And Wardley maps for me, I find are best used if they're broadly right, but potentially precisely wrong. So to cater for people who really are frightened of the complexity, but really want to have the precision that they might have in their other maps. It can be quite a challenge when you're running these sessions. So what I found that quite useful is I've added more anchors and added more colour to the dimensions of the axes to help bring along the conversation. and which brings a much more high quality conversation with the people in the room. So adding elements like a front stage and a backstage, so people can, those who aren't that familiar with how proximity to customer works or to the user works, and they can use this as a rough guide. And then some other questions you can ask around helping positioning on the curve at the bottom. So around the certainty of requirements, the velocity of the change required, and the ubiquity of the thing on the market can help people understand where to put things on the evolution curve. And it brings that common language and that common currency that people can discuss and debate, because you want to remove any debate around that, because actually there's some other things that are more useful to be debating in the room rather than debating how the map looks and the currency that you're using. So yeah, that common currency is really important, and it can be almost anything if the will is just to get started. So I've seen and used activity as an aid to look at how common or not common processes are across our organisation. Looking at technology, using applications as the anchor to begin with, it was a useful step. Capabilities is probably the best, but not something that very many people are that familiar with outside of architecture and technology. And embellish with extra anchors that are meaningful to the room to aid that positioning discussion, so that you can get to that point much more quickly, and that will help them have a much richer discussion, and then you're not wasting and sinking time. Then to the mapping itself. So you've done all your preparation, and you're bringing your people together, and you've got everything set up. Your first 20 minutes are always the hardest, and I found this can be quite a daunting task for me, but it's remember not to panic. So this is what the first 20 minutes can be like. You've done your setup, you've explained the map, you've explained the currency, you've got all of that in place. Everybody's up for doing the work, but they're finding it very difficult to get started. So don't panic, keep going, and by the end, the last 20 minutes can look a lot more like this. So I found that after the first 20 minutes, the workshop starts to run itself. Groups of people start to come together, typically people who don't really interact a lot on a regular basis, having really rich discussions about things that are going on, what things mean, what things are the same, what things are different, where they sit on the map, where there are problems, where there's duplication, where things can be grouped together, where things shouldn't be grouped together. And then you get these really rich conversations. Actually, as a facilitator, you can step back and just observe and answer questions and help push things along, but much less so if you've got the preparation right. So yeah, that first 20 minutes, just stick with it. It can be really painful and feel like an eternity. And the workshop will begin to run itself. They will collaborate more, they will ask more questions, and they start to create the map themselves, which is quite a special thing. So on to the aftermath. So it's not uncommon to feel a bit like this when you've been through a few Wardley mapping sessions. It can be quite tiring. There's a lot of thinking to do, a lot of talking to do, a lot of collaborating to do. But what I've observed is there's a marked positive difference in how the participants collaborate after the fact. So it really adds a change to your culture and your ways of working. It's a real catalyst for that kind of thing, if that's what you need. You can again start to see maps being used to drive debates and decision making. People will get them out, they'll draw their own, and they'll start creating maps for completely different things across the organisation. So that's been a really positive thing I've seen. And also it starts to take on a bit of a life of its own, which means that the onus on one of the only people who knows how to map in your organisation, you might find yourself not being relied on so heavily every time somebody wants to do some mapping. So just to summarise my observations around the activity of mapping and the richness that you can get from that, is that if you want to get that richness, so when preparing, understand your audience and don't be afraid to tweak to get the ball rolling. You can always evolve it to the place you want it to be over time. Getting people in at the ground to understand it in its simplest form will help you get support later on. And that's from anyone from people who are developing on the ground right through to executives. When mapping, don't panic if things are going slowly, stick with it and it will run itself. And after mapping, make the outputs really accessible. I found if you don't do that and it's locked away in a program that no one else can access, it will start to die on the vine. So really creating it in something that will enable other people to use it and add to it and iterate it after the fact is really important. Thank you. That's the end of my presentation.
Well, that was awesome. I have to say, for an opening presentation, that was amazing. And there is probably a quote in there which I think will be difficult to beat, which is Wardley maps, they're useful because they are broadly right, but precisely wrong. I mean, that is just amazing. That for me, that's a wow, standout quote. So first of all, thank you so much. Before we get over to the other two speakers, just a reminder to people in the audience, you can put your questions. There's a Q&A section. I keep on monitoring that. So if you've got questions to ask, put them in there and we'll get everybody, well, hopefully all the speakers to respond. So Mark, Kim, anything you want to raise with the presentation?
Well, I have a question. So Danielle, early on, you talked about having more diversity, and I suddenly thought to myself, I've not really ever done mapping with a gigantic number of people, but later on, the way you're describing it sounded like big workshops. So how many people can you actually get mapping at once?
I think my biggest audience has probably been around between 15 and 20 people.
It's a lot.
Which I think is quite a lot of people to do mapping.
Have you got an ideal size?
Probably between 5 and 10, I would say. 5 and 10, depending on the size of the problem. If the problem's quite a big problem, sort of like an enterprise-wide type problem, then that's the kind of number of people you want in there, and varying different levels of very different views and aspects of the organisation. But if it's a much smaller problem, you're looking at probably less than 7.
Brilliant. Thanks.
Danielle, you work at the Cooperative, which of course is a well-respected retailer within the UK. I mean, just to be clear, is the mapping used within the Cooperative? I mean, how far is it used?
We are using mapping in various different places. So there's a few of our digital product teams will use mapping. We've used mapping on other endeavours across the organisation to look at how things are organised, that kind of thing.
Okay. Now we also have a question which is coming from the audience already. In fact, there's loads. So the first one actually we have is: do you have thoughts on how to define the user to start a mapping activity? And because apparently that's one of the hardest things that people find to do. What's been your experience?
So I suppose I'll use an example of where we use some Wardley mapping to look at processes and how looking at identifying opportunities to bring things together. And then we had a big debate around who the user is, and we got to a point where actually the user is the person who is the recipient of the end product of the process. So the person who doesn't, you're not asking to do very much to be in receipt of that, of the output of the thing.
Okay, at this point I'm going to say, Mark, do you want to chip in?
Yeah, I've found the sessions I run tend to be small groups, 3 or 4 people. Some, when it tends to get bigger groups, you tend to have more lurkers that come along and interested in kind of more about learning about mapping, and then maybe in the sessions after, the 3rd or 4th one, then they start contributing to it.
Yeah, I've been in a situation where we've run a map on an open plan floor in a corner, and people have walked past to get coffee, and then we'd started with 4 people and ended up with 12, all getting engaged and all chipping in and adding to the value that was being created. So I think that's quite useful.
And I've also found, a lot of maps, it doesn't finish in the workplace. It'll carry on, in the evening, in the pub or in the coffee shop, and you'll end up doing maps, maps on napkins and beer mats, and and the conversation continues after the workshop.
Yes.
Yeah.
That actually leads into a question again from our audience, from Rob. So how do you keep a map living? Does it require the same workshop environment with everyone, or can individuals, small groups work on the map to keep it up to date?
The number one thing is to make it accessible, to have it in something that allows other people to use it. So we've recently been using Miro to do that. It's a very big canvas. We've got lots of users on that, so that's a very useful tool to use. But just anything that enables people to access it. So when we were able to be in offices together and see each other in person, having one on the wall was always a good thing as well. So people can see it, they can look at it every day, they can add to it and add post-its to it, add questions. It's not quite as easy now, we're remote, but using tools like that can really help. Everything else after that is just around your culture and ways of working.
Gotcha. Okay, so I mean, you've emphasized again having many people, the ability to challenge the importance of diversity within there. But in many organizations that we exist within, we're ruled by stories, and they're highly political devices. Have you come across those sorts of problems?
Yes, yeah, that those things have surfaced. What I found is the active mapping doesn't leave anywhere for anything like that to hide. Like, as I said in presentation, things either are or they are not. So things that may have been misinterpreted that are the same as something else elsewhere. When you have those mapping discussions, it's very obvious that they are either the same thing or they're not the same thing. So it's quite hard to maintain separation and silos when you're having those sorts of open debates.
You can't hide with maps. Oh, that's another wonderful quote. Kim, Mark, anything to throw in?
Yeah, you know, in my experience, it tends to it can expose some people because it exposes previous decisions. Why did you make that? It was, I know, if you said I was going to, let's build a data center today, if you work through that in a map, that would be probably a crazy decision, yeah, unless you're maybe Amazon or something like that. And it can, I will talk about it later, but with tongue in cheek, I think, if you haven't been fired by creating a map, then you're not doing it right, yeah, because it does expose the organization, the leadership, but it does make it, if you've got an open mind, that's great because you can learn, you can change and fix things. If you haven't, then you may struggle. So I think, I'll talk about it later, but I did get asked to leave twice when I was at the UN. And one of my contracts was terminated early. But, looking back on it, it wasn't a bad thing. It just, it's helped me learn. I think, there's one thing about creating the map, but what do you do with it when you've got the map, and that's, so you also need some skills in kind of influence in managing the managers and the team and organization to actually make that kind of useful and take it to the next step, really.
So another wonderful quote: create a map and get fired. There. Excellent idea. So Kim, have you been fired recently for making a map? Have you faced any of these problems?
I haven't quite gone into that danger zone yet, but I've quite enjoyed, I needed to understand some of the technology landscape of a area. And I did some sessions one-on-one with people, and just the different levels of granularity that people would go into. And, from your project manager who could tell me almost nothing, to a person at the front line who told me about this wonderful batch process that happens every night. It was just amazing to see the broad range of maps that people came up with when I asked them exactly the same question one-on-one.
So Danielle, back to you, and given all of that and how maps can get you fired and everything else, one of the questions we've got from Dave Reed is: transforming large organizations is a huge undertaking and arguably never complete. Really love that you've put mapping at the heart of your work, but what sort of difference has it made to executive decision making? Dave says he's also encountered lots of inertia at this level. So any tips?
I would say it's not something that happens overnight. It is a long slog to get there. So so whilst we've used maps to look at quite big organisational problems, I wouldn't say that the exec were very conscious of that happening during the process. Where we've seen executives really get bought in is when there was an incident that I used maps to pull 3 separate programs together into one place, used a map to demonstrate that these 3 programs were trying to do virtually the same thing. And I got 2 executives to support me on the back of using the maps in changing the way we did that to create something very different out of the back of it. So a program, but not a typical program that was more agile in style. And also reduce the cost of change across those 3 programs to something significantly smaller. So the other thing that really gets their attention is the amount of money you can save and how quickly you could get to the outcomes and the alternatives. Well, the maps are a very useful tool to help show that quite visually, that these things are the same, this thing is different, but that doesn't mean to say that whole program needs to be different. This is another way of looking at how we might reshape this piece of change.
I noticed while you were speaking, particularly when you mentioned about reducing money, Mark was nodding vigorously there at that point. So Mark, any comments?
Yeah, so I think pretty much every place I've been where we've done mapping, where before I even knew about mapping, and then even at the UN, it's definitely made things faster, quicker, cheaper. So from the Unified Pattern Core, the initial estimates would be it was over 10 million plus in 5 years, and that was done in a year for about 800K. So this is a brand new digital core for the whole of Europe for patents. At the UN, the data platform we put in, the initial estimates was, like 5 years, it's impossible, you can't do this, it's the UN, it's going to be too difficult. That was done in about 18 months for about 1 million, and surprised everybody, I think, and caught a lot of the countries off guard, really, because they were probably waiting, they weren't expecting it to happen so quick, and it was there, and that was quite difficult, working with all the countries around the world. And I'd say G-Cloud, but we didn't really use mapping at G-Cloud. That's really when I started getting into it, because I was looking at the cloud stuff and came to the cloud camps. But G-Cloud it saved the government purse, the public purse, billions. I mean, billions. I think it's about 6 billion has gone through G-Cloud, so that's in cloud services. And if those organisations weren't buying cloud services, they'd be buying. So the UK's IT budget is about 16 billion a year. Back at the start of G-Cloud, I think 80% of that went to 6 or 7 companies. But now there's more diverse spend, there's more innovation, and there's more, there's just better services across government. But if that 6 billion was spent with a large 6 or 7, that would probably be 60 billion. So there's ways of saving money, by looking at the maps and getting kind of more efficient and just helping you make the right decision. Yeah.
So I suppose time for a final question. So this one comes from Ian Phillips. You said that mapping changes the way people collaborate afterwards. Have you seen any changes in the way people connect? Who connects, or how ideas are actually generated? And there's another related question in terms of mapping with home workers. How is that working? Are you finding it useful? How are you doing it? So those 2 questions about how are you coping with everybody being physically isolated, with how does mapping help or not, and how does it help change collaboration?
I'd say being remote, starting any new mapping activity with people who haven't done it before is much more difficult, I would say, remotely. For those people who've been through some mapping work already, we have a map and it needs to be iterated. That's much easier. I would also say that going to the other question around why is that collaboration different? It's almost, the analogy is almost like two people who just learned a new language, and they're both able to now speak that language. So their communications are much more easy around even sometimes very difficult topics. You can see that a marked difference in that. There's less apprehension. So from just the act of being in the same place and going through an experience together, you start to build and form a relationship. That's one part of it. But the other part of it is to have that common understanding of what A means to you means B to me, and I know that now, so I can have that conversation with you, and it's much easier. So that's why, that's from my observation, why I think, well, what I've seen of the cultural change afterwards is quite marked.
Mark, Kim, any final comments or questions you want to add in?
We tend to use Google Sheets for maps. And when we were at the UN, it was important to pick a tool that was available kind of globally, apart from there's some issues in China, but not all the SAS tools are available everywhere and perform well everywhere. So we just use Google Sheets, and you can all collaborate at the same time, chat, add comments. And even at some points, people can't join the meeting, so you can record it. And they can always add comments to the sheet later if they need to, yeah, or if they want to. And then you've got a record of change as well within Google Sheets because you've got the history.
Well, I'm going to say, Danielle, thank you so much for that talk. We've got a load of questions, which far too many to get answered. I mean, we'll try and come back to them in the other breaks. But fabulous job. Thank you so much. And now our next speaker, Kim. Transforming Australia, Agile. First of all, delight. Fantastic. I know it's late where you are, so I'll stop the blah, 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 and I'll hand over to you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Simon. And I'll just have a go at sharing my screen and make sure that technology works for us. So let's see how that goes. All right, you can see my screen now, I'm assuming. Yes. Wonderful. All right, so I'm going to focus on the sense-making aspect of making a map. So that's how I've interpreted it's not the map, it's the mapping activity. All right, so let me just get here. There we go. Oh, hang on, you got to do the click thing. There we go. So what is the mapping activity? Well, we all know what a map is and how to make it, right? We grab some needs, or we might grab some focal areas. I've been playing around with lots of different things that we can do on maps. Then, of course, underneath those, you have functions, you have systems, you have processes, and of course, we have some sort of maturity scale along the bottom. What we're actually doing when we're pulling all of these things together is sense making. Now, it has taken me quite a while to figure out what is this sense-making thing? I first came across it with the Cynefin framework, and I struggled with the idea of it. So I just wanted to take you through a bit of a process to help you see how I came to understand sense-making and how I see it works from a mapping perspective. So first of all, what do we get when we create a Wardley map? Well, we get a map, okay? So it's a thing. It's a thing that people can look at. It's a thing that people can say, well, that looks a bit wrong. It's a thing that people can go, hey, where's this bit? And it's a thing that people can go, well, that shouldn't be here. That should be over there, right? So it's a thing. It's tangible. So what's fantastic about a Wardley map is it's very easy to say to someone, let's create a thing and get them rallied around and get them working. That's pretty cool. All right, but we get some other stuff as well. All right, so when you say to people, what are you thinking? They've all got a picture in their head. So this is a very simplistic, I've asked 3 people, think of a piece of fruit. Okay, so we've got a banana, and another person thinks of a bit of watermelon, and the third one, I think I tried to draw a strawberry there, but I'm not quite sure I'm good at that. So unless they talk to each other, they could be thinking that everyone's thinking of a banana, or everyone's thinking of a watermelon, or everyone's thinking of a strawberry, right? So until we get that out of our heads and into somewhere that everyone can see, we don't know that we're all thinking different things. So what we get when we're starting the mapping process is we get the ability to put things out there on a Miro board or on a wall or whatever, and people get to see that we've all got different points of view. And it can create a shared understanding. And I noticed that Danielle mentioned shared understanding as well. So that's pretty cool. We're aligned on that. We have a shared understanding that mapping gives us shared understanding, and I've just gone meta. Awesome. Brilliant. Okay, so that's one of the things that we get. Well, what else do we get? Now, with apologies to the people who, you know, where this parable have come from, but imagine there's 3 of us. And we've all been blindfolded and we're walked up towards an elephant. And one of us touches the tail, right? And we think, well, that's a piece of rope. And the second of us touches the trunk and we go, well, that's obviously a garden hose. And the third one touches the skin and it feels a bit rough. We go, oh, it's a piece of sandpaper. Now it's actually an elephant, but the restricted points of view that we have mean that we think it's completely different. And until we get together and get some more points of view, we're not even going to imagine that we're actually touching the same thing, right? So the other thing that we get is we get the ability to expose multiple points of views. Fabulous. So here's a little story. Once upon a time, I was at a place and we used to have a lot of billing systems, right? And this was before I knew what Wardley maps were, so I never Wardley mapped it. But the point is, you go to someone and you go, well, how many billing systems have we got here? And the first person would say, oh, I think we've got about 3 billing systems. And the second person would go, no, we've got about 5. And I thought there were a lot. So I used to go around joking, you know, this place had this kind of mantra: why have one system that does something when you can have 3 or 4, unless it's a billing system, in which case you need 20, right? Then one day I was talking to an enterprise architect and I basically said that what I just said. And he goes, no, Kim, we've actually got 120 billing systems here. So when we start doing mapping activities, we get shared understanding and we also get to expose multiple points of view to each other. And it's really interesting. I've started to realize when you use canvases and templates, things like Wardley maps and so on, it actually gives us permission to ask quite probing questions that if you didn't have a bit of paper in front of you, would come across as quite rude, right? How many billing systems have we got is very different to, can you draw me where the billing systems sit on this map, right? Which is pretty cool. So here's the tricky part, and this is the sense making, because I see the value in doing these activities is the sense making aspect of it. We're making sense of things, we're sharing understanding, we're sharing multiple points of view, we're coming towards an alignment. But it's very hard for me to go into someone and say, hey, let's do some sense making. It's much easier to say, let's create a map. So if I was doing it the other way, I'd go, hey, we've got a bunch of stuff. It's a whole bunch of different levels of granularity, and we're going to do wonderful things with all of this stuff. People are going to go, Kim, go away. That sounds like a pointless activity. I just need to get my work done, right? So this is the thing in common with the Cynefin framework, okay? The Cynefin framework I came across and I got so excited about it, and whenever I wanted to use Cynefin, I'd go up to people and go, oh, we could use Cynefin here, blah, 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 blah. And after about 15 minutes, their eyes would glaze over and I'd lost them when I just wanted to get on with it. So the thing with Cynefin, I had quite a few insights. After about 3 months, I suddenly realized it was something to help us check things rather than a direct use tool. And then after about 3 years, I realized it wasn't very, very useful as an objective framework. It was more useful as what I call a subjective framework. And this is where the sense making aspect comes into it. So what I mean by objective is if you go to the Cynefin framework and you try and say, here's this thing, and I'm going to put it on the framework, and objectively every single person should be agreeing with me that it goes in that one spot, right? Well, that's not as useful as, here's this one thing, and this person over here says it's got hardly any uncertainty about it, but this person over here says it's, you know, it's a can of worms, it's a bundle of stuff. Well, with the Cynefin framework, you can actually end up writing 2 post-it notes and go, well, what's the element that's really quite simple or obvious or clear? And what's the element that's quite complex or can of worms? And instead of people arguing, no, it's this, no, it's that, what happens is they're busy trying to articulate where it goes onto the framework. So we're able to share sometimes quite hot differences in points of view, and we can take the heat out of the conversation and calm people down because they're busy trying to put it onto a framework, which is cool. Because the same thing happens with Wardley mapping, right? We can have the same kind of conversations, we can have the same kind of disagreements, and then we can get people going, well, actually, where is it in the value chain? Is it near the top? Is it near the bottom? Is it, you know, and where is it on genesis to commodity? Is it right down the we're creating it, or is it you can just plug it in level, or is it somewhere in between? Where does it go? Rather than, oh no, we should never have bought that system, right? And you never get anywhere when you have those conversations. So the tricky part is selling people the sense-making aspect, sharing points of view and alignment. But the thing that they think they're getting is a map, which is also valuable, but I think it's not quite as valuable as the sense-making aspect. So to me, I call it, there's real value and real value. So the real value to me is get groups of people sitting around creating Wardley maps, all right, which is fabulous. And then the other real value is you do end up with something tangible that people can work with. And the other story that I've got, I once worked with a government department, and I had a choice. What the problem was, they had a part of the process and a decision-making body in that process that wasn't working very well. And they needed to make a decision whether they kept that group going and supported it to get better, or whether they eliminated it and devolved those decisions to other areas. So I could have used the Cynefin framework and facilitated it that way, but I chose to use a Wardley map instead, and that worked beautifully because I had people in that group who were quite structured in their thinking. And the Wardley map gave them a very nice structure to put, because we mapped to the process. So we basically had how close was the process, the value chain was how close the process was to the people that could see it. But the horizontal axis was how well developed was the process, were the bits of the process. Was it a process that's repeatable, everyone knows what to do, or was it a complete schmozzle? Yeah, so using a Wardley map allowed me to achieve the outcome. We did the sense-making activity, but the map gave them something that felt extremely tangible to them, and it was very successful. So that's basically the end of my presentation. So thank you very much for listening.
Awesome, Kim. Awesome. There's so many quotes, so many things to ask. One of the things you really emphasize here is the key is not the map, but the sense making. And there was one line that you said, they give us permission to ask questions. I am, first of all, I'm a big fan of, I'm a bit of a curmudgeon, but there's not many things I like, but I do like Cynefin and the work that's done in that space. But, you know, I'm known to rail against storytelling because of the politics of storytelling and stories. And it's very difficult to challenge whatever has become the official narrative. So I love the fact you talk about give us permission to ask questions. Can you give us a bit more details, possibly some examples, etc.?
Oh, yes. It is really interesting. Give me a framework like Cynefin. I was in a particular meeting and we were talking about a way a system works, right? And I was asking quite pointed questions, but because I was asking the question for where does it go on the board, because I was writing these things up on the Cynefin framework, people were very happy to share the information with me. And I remember at one stage, and this was the example of taking the heat out of conversation as well. One person in the room said, oh, well, that table, you know, that should be sitting on the complicated side, because so long as you know what the table has in it, everyone knows it's got 22 data item types in it. Fabulous. And then another person piped up and said, yeah, but we don't know what they all mean. Right? And you could see it was it was about to be a bit of a fight about it. And I said, oh, well, that's okay. because we'll put there's 22 items in the table, or 22 elements in the table on the complicated side, and we'll put but we don't know what they mean on the complex side, right? So that was really cool. Because I had that framework, I was able to focus the conversation on where does it go in the framework and how they were both right, rather than no, you're wrong, no, you're wrong, no, you're right, no, you're right. It was really cool.
Danielle, you seem to be nodding vigorously at that point. Can I ask you to jump in?
I just think it's quite a beautiful thing to be able to remove that heat from the debate and to move past the stories that are told and to look at what's really happening, and using the maps as a tool to have that discussion and debate of where it sits, asking lots of different questions about, you know, well, how often does this thing need to change? Or not very often. Well, we can move it down further down here, can't we? We can maybe look to do something a bit different with that, or actually no, we're not doing enough with that thing, so it needs to change more frequently, so we need to do something different around how we manage and operate it. And it's not a criticism of how people do things today, and what I found was that people don't take it like that when you're in a mapping session, but if you did it in a completely different setting, it could become quite combative, which isn't helpful or doesn't move you any further forward.
Mark, anything to add into that? And I'm going to also throw open the question of, well, I used to work for government where we don't have any duplication at all. Oh, Mark, there's always going to be one. You're on mute.
Yeah, well, I haven't got anything to add really. I mean, there's an incredible amount of duplication, but when so at the UN, working with the statistical organizations, we through doing that kind of profile map where you can see all the where different organizations are in their different phases of different components, you could identify that some statistical offices were, you know, still using surveys for collecting data, and others were using kind of government data, and the efficiencies from left to right are incredible. So organizations that are still doing surveys, so the UK, the US and Australia. So Australia spent $1 billion on your survey, on your census. The UK is going to spend $1 billion, and the US is spending $15.4 billion on their census. If you look at the Nordics and Denmark, they use their government data, you know, from the tax systems and health and to do their census, and they run their census overnight with 4 people, and they haven't done a census since 1970. And on a map, it's quite clear, you know, if you're on the right-hand side, there's some efficiencies of access to a utility of data, you know, as a service. And on the kind of in your custom built area, you know, a lot of the offices tend to just build everything from scratch for themselves, and it's expensive, it's slow, and it's not very efficient. And if you look at the right-hand side, you know, especially Denmark and Niels and their office, you know, they're using their access to government data is a lot easier, and you know, they're I guess they're saving, you know, $1 billion every 10 years.
I know you like your billions. I'm sure you're going to tell us later on about how you saved UK government. What was it, 12 billion? I'm sure
the
we
UK
will get to
economy, that. 12 billion.
Okay,
yeah.
Well, we'll get to that a bit
later.
later. Anyway, so a couple of other questions here. Do you when you're teaching people mapping, is there an ideal length of time to a workshop? I know this is sort of one of the how long is a piece of string, but a question from Adler. How long does it take somebody?
Yeah, so I always create facilitation plans when I do a workshop or a working session, and I find that a lot of these techniques, an hour just isn't quite there, and 90 minutes is comfortable. So an hour, you usually, unless it's a very small thing, or if you're doing something one-on-one, an hour is plenty of time. But if it's a workshop or a working session, 90 minutes is probably the minimum comfortable time. But if you need to do iterations on things, then you need to kind of multiply that out a couple of times. So that's how I would guide the how long it takes to actually facilitate a workshop from my experience.
Okay, and sort of related question. particularly for new mappers. So as a new mapper, and this comes from Sam, as a new mapper, how do I keep it simple? Frame the right question. Can you give some practical tips, examples, how to get started?
That is the gold, right? The gold part of it. I actually created one the other day. What I was doing, I was using Jay Bloom's idealized design constraints identification stuff. And what I ended up with was a list of themes that described ideal current state, and then a list of constraints underneath. I'm like, oh, I can make this into a Wardley map. And so I started, but of course I had like 5 different themes up the top, and I had, I don't know, 7 or 8 constraints down the bottom. And I started to think, oh, this is going to have a lot of lines on it. So I think what I need to do is I need to pull out just one theme and then map the constraints to that. So I'm better off to have 5 different maps per theme than to try and put all of it onto one map. So it does take a bit of experimentation, and you can sort of try and boil, I call it, you know, trying to boil the ocean, and I'd rather just boil the kettle. So what is the thing that we can put at the top that's the focal area that'll be tight enough to get us a useful thing, but loose enough to allow all of that diversity of thought and raising of different levels of understanding. Yeah. It's not a very good answer.
No. I mean, it is, and I'm going to ask Danielle, because Danielle obviously is you've been teaching a lot of people, it seems, within the co-op. Any hints and tips that you can give in how to make it simple, the ideal time, that sort of thing?
Yeah, so kind of depends on the size of the problem that you're tackling. So I think 90 minutes is a good amount of time for something that's relatively small. So batches of 90-minute time slots are ideal for something quite large and significant. So I think the biggest mapping session I've done has gone over 2 days, but we spread it out over a number of 90-minute sessions with breaks, because people's brains just stop functioning and they get distracted. So getting those regular breaks in, which is good practice for any type of workshop, mapping or not. Then to keep it really simple is to try and identify what people want out of the session, or there's a reason why it's called. You don't just do a mapping session for the sake of it, unless you're a real nerd like me. But there's usually a reason that you do that, so you anchor it around that, and then people are already they're already on the bus because the outcome that they're looking for is the same thing. So that I find that quite useful too. So if it's about finding duplication, or if it's about how do we best serve a user need, then make that the focal point of how you drive the activity on the map.
Okay, and we've also got a question that's come in from Luciana here. Have any of you ever mapped personal matters? I mean, like maybe personal finance or some long-term career goal. Do you think mapping applies to the personal landscape too? And the reason why I'm throwing that in is because we've talked about co-op, we're talking about government areas and large organizations. What about the personal? So it's a question of scale here, which also links to earlier questions. Is it, is it about an organization? Is it about a project? Is it about a person? Any comments on that? And I'm going to throw that to both Kim and Danielle.
So I haven't done one personally for myself, but I did one not long ago for a person who runs a place an accelerator. And so, what we were helping him to understand was that he was kind of the bottleneck in things. And what was beautiful, and it didn't really matter where things were on the map, what was really stood out was a whole bunch of lines ended up drawn to him and his role. And he's like, yeah, that's why things are slowing down. So no, I haven't done it personally for myself, but I think something like what we did with that person would help show quite a lot of information about what you were looking at in your life.
Danielle?
So I have not done anything personal myself. I know people who have, who've used it for that purpose and got some good results from that. I think you can do them at any scale. I think understanding that scale is quite important and allowing enough time to do the work. So it could be an enterprise-wide thing, so that's very, very wide but very not very deep. Or it could be on just a particular product or a particular feature that you're trying to work on. So they do work at different scales. You just have to prepare quite differently for each type of workshop that you're going to have. Most of my work's been, or actually I've done enterprise-wide versions, or like functional or program-wide versions, or product versions, and I've had relatively good success with all of those, but it's all in the planning.
Gotcha. So two other questions, sort of related. I'm going to put them together. One's from Emma. You've mentioned influencing culture change through mapping. Could you explain more about how this can work across organizations? Now, that question was originally to Danielle, but I'm going to, again, give it to the both of you. And another one is, have you mapped anything that is not intrinsically technology centric? Okay, so there's two questions there about influencing culture and mapping something which isn't just about technology, which may include cultural aspects as well. And so I'm going to open, sorry, to Kim, Daniel, and also Mark as well. Come and join us, Mark. What's your thoughts?
Danielle, you want to go first?
Yeah, I can go first. So I think that what mapping really does is it creates a spark to start to create that cultural change. You definitely see behaviours are different, relationships are formed, and because it's created an environment which may not feel like there's a lot of psychological safety as they're walking into the session, as the sessions progress, the psychological safety increases. So you have those more open debates, those things that were very politically contentious or sore points are openly discussed in a very matter-of-fact manner. So when people are able to do that with each other around things that have that kind of thing attached to them, they can bring that outside into the workplace. So when something contentious comes up later on, they can have a much more productive discussion about it, either with or without the map, because they've built that relationship and that trust between them. I tend to find when people are sort of using stories to debate and discuss whether one way of approaching something was right or wrong, that just creates more animosity through further down the line. Where if you're using mapping to have that discussion, you take all of that away. So that's what I really like about it. And there's no blame attached to anything either, because you're taking it to a very logical place. We're putting this thing on a map and we're deciding where it sits, and by doing so we're answering lots of questions that you may or may not be aware of.
Fabulous. Kim.
Yeah, and from what sort of things can you put on maps? All sorts of things. The one I just mentioned before was, how do these constraints relate to the themes of ideal current state? We're thinking about mapping complex risks from a disaster resilience and recovery perspective. There's the one that we did with that person who was sort of the key element in the chain, that was nothing to do with technology. That was all to do with elements of the business. So I love playing around with the horizontal and the vertical axes and trying out different things. So a lot of my stuff ends up being quite ephemeral and just for in the moment use from a mapping perspective.
Mark, what about yourself? Is it just all technology? Have you gone beyond that into things like culture as well?
Well, we haven't gone into culture, but as part of the UN, as part of a handbook we put together to explain mapping to members of the UN and the stats organization, we actually use the SDGs. So the SDGs are the Sustainable Development Goals. So all members of the UN have signed up to these huge goals, and to, by 2030 to remove poverty, for example. So as part of that guide and how to map and what morning mapping is, we actually use the SDG 911. And that's not just about technology, that includes kind of a, policy, legislation, trust, and all that's in a handbook. So I'll just put that in the chat now, and you can go have a look. And just go back to the, dealing with the kind of complexities of mapping and people getting into the weeds, we tend to use submaps. So you can have a large map and you can have submaps, and it's quite easy to say, well, let's not go into that detail now. That's a submap. We can come back in another session, another 90-minute session, and we can go into that in more detail. And you can start with kind of your overall organizational view or whatever it is you're mapping at a high level, and then you can create submaps and say, right, let's come back and look at that as a submap. You might need some different people there. You might need some additional insight. So we tend to use the kind of submaps. And a good example of that one is when we did the encryption techniques at the UN. So there's another handbook I'll put in the chat in a minute, and you'll see there's an overall map, and then there's individual submaps for each of the different kind of encryption techniques.
So go help yourself to the UN's handbooks on mapping, which are in the chat. Isn't that awesome? Well, one of the, so just going back to this point of culture, one of the things, and building on what Kim and Danielle said, I actually personally took a whole group of people who were, half of which were extreme Remain and half which were extreme Leave. And we managed to work together and map out Brexit and its implications on a map, which had we not had a vehicle to discuss, if it had been narrative based, it would just have been conflict. And this actually led to the culture map. So it's a map of how to look at culture. But fabulous job, Kim. Thank you ever so much. And I'm so pleased you've come and joined us, because I know it's quite late where you are. And at this point in our last half hour, it's time to throw over to Mark. So Mark, you have the ball.
Okay, let me share my screen. Are we good? Can you see it? Hang on a minute. Right, can everybody see that? Is that good? Yep, right, thumbs up. Right, okay, so I'm just going to talk about my experience of mapping from, back in 2012, starting off at the kind of Houses of Parliament, all the way through to the kind of UN recently. And I think let's start with a few problems, with mapping in my experience over the last, nearly 10 years, I guess. There appears to be only one source of the truth for mapping, and that's Simon. Yeah. So if Simon tweets about you as a mapper or something, that gives you some kind of endorsement, and there's lots of people mapping out there, and then we need to, how do you find the mappers? Who are they? If you want to do some mapping, if you want some training, there's quite a few people on Twitter that you can find if you search, around Simon and Ward mapping, that are, that kind of do training and help people with maps, from all different angles. There isn't a body of knowledge, yeah. So if you want to find out about mapping, you have to trawl the whole of the internet, because it's like everywhere, yeah. There's bits in Simon's old blog, there's bits in his new blog, which is a book. So it's not really a body of knowledge on mapping. You have to read the book, and you have to pull the details out of the book to understand some elements. There isn't, some of the best insights are on Twitter when Simon gets challenged on Twitter. So you have to trawl back through Twitter for 10 years to find there's some really good stuff, and there's some really good maps that get produced as by challenging, Simon on Twitter. So I suggest you do that more often. Yeah. There's lack of training for mapping. So there's people that offer training and consultancies around training, but there isn't any kind of formal training. But we can talk about that a bit later. People don't share their maps, right? So the maps that people generally share, I would say, are not important, or they're not really their strategy. Some do, but if it really, if you've got a really good map, and it is your company's organization and strategy, you're less likely to share it. At the end of this, we can talk about another way of learning about mapping and creating maps that for good that you can share, and we can share with everybody. So we'll talk about it with the SDGs later. And mapping and challenges everything in your organization. So prepare to get fired. Which is why it's dangerous. Yeah, but it's also it's also very good. So I started off mapping, not really mapping. I found out about mapping when I was at the Houses of Parliament and into the Cabinet Office and G-Cloud, and actually did some mapping at the Land Registry in Axelos, and we'll kind of go from. So when I was at the Houses of Parliament, I was brought in to look at their kind of IT strategy. And, you know, for some people, the strategy is, well, we're going to deploy the next version of Windows, or, you know, we're going to upgrade to Exchange 2012 or whatever it is. And that's not really strategy, and that's not really transformative. And the challenges around the House of Parliament was, it took a long time to deploy kit. So every, you know, we fire our MPs every, you know, 4 years, and we get, you know, 680, 50 new ones, whatever it is now. And it was a challenge to give them new kit on day one, because they had to build machines, and they don't know you don't know who's going to turn up until the next day, yeah, because you don't know who's going to win. So you can't do a lot of preparation. There's lots of, you know, where they're going to sit in Parliament, and people shift around. So there was, so we was looking at kind of, you know, kind of cloud and various different cloud services for office systems. And, you know, the outcome there was, you know, looking at cloud. And this is when I went to one of the first cloud camps in London, and there's the guy Simon talking about maps and mapping and cats fighting each other. And that was it. And it was like, bingo, I've got it. I understand it now. And that helped kind of talk internally at Parliament how, you know, we were going to move to cloud, and how it was safe, and how it was just, we had to, you know, there was no choice about it really. That's, you know, that's where technology was going. And, you know, the outcome of that is, you know, the MPs get their kit on day one at the start of every new Parliament. You know, there's a cloud first policy back in 2012 for the Houses of Parliament, and then there was a kind of a delivery plan and roadmap to, you know, to kind of get them there. So then the Cabinet Office G Cloud. So again, I was still exploring Wardley mapping, still learning about it. There wasn't much material around. There was some stuff on Simon's blog post, there's Twitter. A cloud camp was a good source of information, because Simon would do kind of new talk about different maps every time, maybe about cloud, maybe about machine learning, or, you know, different types of technology. And you could see the maps, and you could kind of understand them and understand how they were put together. And it was, you know, you know, trying to transform the way. So, you know, I guess, you know, the key people there were Chris Chan and Tim Hanley, and yeah, it was a very small team, but it was like the government spent 16 billion on IT back in, you know, 2013, and most of that, you know, I think 80% goes to 6 or 7 large suppliers, and which meant, you know, the solutions we got weren't innovative. They were just rotating around the different suppliers every time. You know, you weren't really getting the best. There was no, you know, you wouldn't get the best price, best service, you know, best opportunities and all that. So the plan around G Cloud was trying to disrupt that market by making it easier for the public sector to buy cloud. And basically, you know, I think today there's been about 6.5 billion of cloud services bought by the UK government, and you hear stories of, you know, savings of 80-90% on IT projects through using cloud services. But again, you know, it was quite hard looking at mapping. It wasn't widely known, understood. So I guess, you know, it's on the left of your map, and it was finding examples and use cases. So, well, this is where mapping's been used and it saved money, or it's given a better outcome and a better decision, was quite hard and difficult to find. Getting onto the kind of land registry. So there was more information about mapping. I was understanding it better, but it was still about me and my experience. And it wasn't really a team exercise then. It was, there was, you know, Simon was quite involved with the Cabinet Office at the time, and he was, there were some kind of challenges of mentioning Wardley mapping, or Simon Wardley and the Cabinet Office, because, you know, some government departments, specifically the land registry, you know, weren't open to, you know, changes. Yeah, I'm trying to put it in a nice way. Yeah. So for me, you know, that experience was really good. You know, so it was about changing the incumbent supplier, which and open up the, you know, the services in the land registry to enable more digital services. And, you know, and it was quite challenging, and, you know, and it was quite threatening at sometimes, because there was change and it exposed some, you know, decisions, and there was a large incumbent there, and, you know, it was difficult. But, you know, the land registry is moving on now with some cracking digital services, and, you know, and it was really tough for me at that time, kind of working with the land registry. But, you know, that's in the past, and now they've got, you know, a path to kind of digital services. So Axelos is a joint venture between the Cabinet Office in the Capita. So this is where I really started using kind of maps, and this was a brand new organization set up from scratch, and it had to take on, you know, so Axelos actually owns Prince 2 and ITIL, so we probably all know about them. And to give you kind of size and scale of, you know, some like the Prince 2 and ITIL as kind of frameworks. So Axelos, I think, turns over 40 million a year, and they've got assets on their books of 100 million. Right. So this is the, you know, potential for Wardley mapping, I guess. So yeah. So there, you know, and that was a really easy organization. There was a new director came in. He was from the gaming industry, actually. And it, you know, it was just really easy to have these conversations. You know, why would we spend, you know, several million on a proprietary lockdown kind of service, and it's going to take years to build, and when we could spend, you know, a quarter of that and kind of use some cloud services, and it'll be easier to change, because we don't really know the shape of the organization, what it's going to look like, so we need something that's easy to change. So that was really easy. And actually, you know, the commitment there, I think, from Axelos was it would give the taxpayers 500 million over 10 years. And then if you look at it now, you know, they turn over 40 million, 49% goes to the Treasury and Cabinet Office. And we should ask what they're doing with that money, actually, because it all comes from education and training. You know, are they putting that back into the economy? You know, we should ask. So if anybody's listening from the Treasury, what are you doing with that money? And then moving on to the Unified Patent Court. So again, this is a brand. So I would say most of my experience of maps is really kind of like on the right-hand side in the kind of utility commodity space, and kind of moving from trying to get organizations to move from custom built product into that kind of cloud space. And that's kind of where most of my experience comes from, really. So the Unified Patent Court, brand new court across Europe, well, not all 28 member states, two didn't join, and one's just left. So that was more about more collaboration. It was working in teams, and we did some mapping. And this was kind of came out of the Intellectual Property Office, actually, in the UK, but we were doing it for the European Court, which actually technically isn't a EU institution. It is an actual international patent court, just for a bit of clarity. And you know, the initial estimate is, it's going to be tens of millions. It's going to cost 5 years. It's really complicated. This is the court. It's all digital. It's all new. And we did it in about 12 months in about 800K. And we used kind of cloud services, and well, just getting into the cloud services, let's say, we used kind of services to build a court. Basically all courts do is process paper. You fill in a form, you go to court, you get some more forms. So, it's not really complicated, but there is a huge amount of rules based around the court. So we did that, and and I think interestingly, working with the court is so in Europe, in Germany, as an example, when it comes to kind of laws, if it doesn't say you can do it, you can't do it, right? And in the UK, it's the opposite round. If it doesn't say you can't do it, you can. So you've got this kind of completely different views about the rules of the court. So the Germans say, if it's not in the rules, you can't do it, right? But the UK say, well, it's not in the rules, we can do it. And it's just it's quite interesting, and it's right, intellectual property. So still at the Intellectual Property Office, finished the Unified Patent Court, all done, record time. Right, Mark, that was brilliant what you did for Unified Patent Court. Can you do something for the Intellectual Property Office? We've got this new patent system. Can you look at it? So again, we did some maps. We look at different services. Again, looking at kind of cloud and technology, and we did quite a few maps. And we identified, there are cloud services or utility services that can deliver a patent service, because basically it's filling in a form online, processing the workflow, and kind of giving you kind of the answer back. So again, we looked at and this was really with Martin O'Brien, who's now moved to the planning directorate, and we looked at doing the map. We looked at services. We did some testing, and I call it prove it. So basically, when back in those days, people say, yeah, everybody's got a cloud service. There's lots of cloud washing. Everybody's got a SaaS service, and the simple thing to do is say, well, prove it. Right? Give me an account now? Can I log in? Can I use it? Yeah. And back in the time, probably 70% you wouldn't hear from them again, because it would take them 6 weeks to go and create an account for you. Yeah. So it wasn't really SaaS. It wasn't really services. And then we found actually the companies that could give you a SaaS service tended to be the smaller enterprise, small SMEs and smaller companies, organizations, and they would have very niche services. So they may have a really good online form system, or a really good workflow system or something like that. And what we ended up doing, we called it, we were doing the gluing, not the doing. Yeah, so we were gluing these different components together via their APIs and different services. So I think Martin O'Brien came up with that. United Nations. So after the patent office, so actually the work for the United Nations was done at the Office for National Statistics, and they're in the same building as the Intellectual Property Office, share the same canteen stuff. So I got a call to come in and say, well, we need to build this global platform for the UN. You know, what is it? So, and this was, you know, that was pretty much the brief. So, you know, trying to understand what this was, what they were looking for. So that involved a lot of maps. There are tons of maps we produced for that, and you can see some examples in the template. And I think there's plenty of presentations and slides about mapping and the UN out there. But again, this was, you know, working together in collaboration. We worked in teams to produce the maps. We produced, you know, quite a lot of maps. And a lot of this was done, you know, either online or, you know, in workshops or in a pub or in a coffee shop. And, you know, it was probably 50-50 between doing maps, you know, in online or in a workshop and doing them, you know, after, because we do a session for maybe 90 minutes or 2 hours. And you get, you know, you would get, it is quite exhausting. And then you go, right, I know you finish the day or go for lunch or whatever, and then you come back, and then you would continue the conversation, you know, over lunch or in the coffee shop or in a bar, you know, at the end of the day. And then maps would be drawn on, you know, beer mats and napkins, and, you know, you do some more, you know, knowledge sharing about the types of maps and why, you know, the different areas of maps. And that's kind of how we did it. And there are tons of maps we did at the UN. And we, you know, so the outcome for the UN is, you know, there's a big data platform. So the big data platform, one of the services in there takes live data, a data stream of ships and flights. And back in the 2008, when we had the last kind of world recession, Ivo Havinia from UNSD, the stats office, said, look, you know, back in then we could see there's less ships moving around, but we didn't know why, and we didn't know what was happening. And that was an early indicator of pending doom. So we drew some maps around, you know, how can we get access to ship data and flight data, and they're, you know, they're available as services, data services with APIs, as a commodity service, and, you know, quite low cost, quite easy to get access, but you get this massive data stream. So we built a platform, all in cloud. So the UN's cloud uses Amazon, Microsoft, Google, and Alibaba. And you stream the data in there, you can analyze the data, and you can see where ships are moving, not moving, etc. And back in 2008, it took ONS 12 weeks to provide the data to the Treasury, the Cabinet Office, and the Bank of England about we're doomed. You know, we're in, you know, it's not pending, it's happened, and, you know, this is what's happened. And every week it took ONS to provide that data to the Cabinet Office, Bank of England, and the Treasury. Cost the UK economy 1 billion, sorry. So over 12 weeks, it cost the UK economy 12 billion because it took that amount of time to provide the data. Now, with the COVID, the platform was there, the data was there, the real-time ship data. So when the request came in from the Cabinet Office to ONS, you know, they look at the UN global platform because the data's there, it's real time. It took a bit to, you know, create the algorithms to understand the data and produce the reports. But that data was provided to the Cabinet Office, Treasury, and the Bank over the weekend. So that meant, you know, they can make the decisions. They knew the impending doom, and we could see where flights were coming out of China. We could see which countries were going to impact. That could be fed to the FCO, the Foreign Commonwealth Office. So we knew where we would need to potentially, you know, repatriate people, and you could see the impact globally. You could see the impact on trade. You could see the trade wasn't coming out of China because they were, you know, locked down. And all that information was fed into the Cabinet Office, the Bank of England, and the Treasury. And, you know, so, you know, I can assume, you know, it saved the UK economy at least 12 billion because that data was provided, you know, at the weekend. And there was a team of people working tirelessly over the weekends in ONS actually producing that data, the reports to those offices. Now, that platform is also used by the Federal Reserve Bank, you know, the US. There's dozens of countries that use that. So, you know, I'm just going to be bold and say, actually, we probably saved the world economy about 100 billion. So that's kind of the and there, you know, my experience there with different kind of leadership there, it was easy. It was really easy to do the maps. Simon Taylor from ONS supported the kind of mapping with his teams, and you know, and that led to, you know, some changes in ONS. So the work with the UN helped ONS change and get the Cloud First policy in place. Now, one thing I've put in there, I can't remember if I did, you know, I've seen some people talk about maps being patterns, and I don't think they're patterns, because, you know, they may be specific at that time on that day, but tomorrow they could quite easily change. So they're not patterns. And, you know, the same, you know, the maps are used for like the, you know, like the Houses of Parliament and the land registry about, you know, moving the cloud. It's not the same map for ONS. So ONS's approach is cloud, but it's serverless. Yeah. So the actual census application is a serverless application, and that scales to 25 million people. So and you know, I think you know, maps are not patterns. Yeah. And some of the, you know, tools and services we developed and used in the commodity services and open source stuff we used at the UN, you know, ONS kind of adopted that well, Apache NiFi. So what I'm doing now, so it's Chicati, so it's a non-profit. So we've got lots of maps actually about training and education and Wardley mapping. And now we're building out, so all the stuff I've learned over the, I don't know, last, what, 8-10 years about mapping and learning mapping and finding resources, you know, we're pulling all that together. We're building some training courses on Wardley mapping. You can see, what I'll do actually, because I don't think you can click on the links, I'll put some of the links. So there's a foundation course we're developing on Wardley mapping. So we're doing that in the open, and you can see the kind of learning outcomes, the syllabus. And actually we had quite a good session last week where we started writing some kind of exam questions, and so that was quite interesting. We're on the UK's digital marketplace, so we're you know, the UK public sector can buy Wardley training from us, and also the thing we're working towards is off-qual. So they're in the UK, they regulate qualifications, exams, and assessments. So we're looking at getting our Wardley map training as an official off-qual qualification in the UK. So that means people can use it as credits towards university degrees, etc. And we can also look at training apprentices. And one of the things we did, looking at kind of training and education around Wardley mapping, is the demographics for Wardley mapping appear to be over 35 and Apple fanboys. Yeah. So I don't know if that's true. And, you know, we really do need to do a lot more looking at the younger generation, and, you know, making sure they have the skills as well for mapping in the future. So, you know, that's something we're gonna look at. So I think that's me done. So yeah.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Mark. So I'm doing a bit of teaching at different universities, so we are trying to get the next generation using mapping as well. So lots of things. The problem is Simon. Challenge him more often. I'd love that quote. Yes, government. It's fair to say that certain departments I wasn't loved in. I mean, I think that is fair to say. When I partly wrote the Better for Less paper, which led to transformations, the introduction of spend control, and so I was often involved in challenging. So yes, thank you for reminding me that I'm not popular with some, which is perfectly true. Maps are not patterns. Fascinating. No, they're not. They're just, but you can learn patterns on the maps. So really broad ranging. So Kim, Danielle, any questions to fire into Mark?
I have a question. So I noticed when you were going through your timeline, you started to talk about teams producing the maps in the UN 2018 one. So I was just wondering, did you do it sort of mostly by yourself up until then, or was it always a bit of a team activity?
No, it really started off with me, myself, and I, and then probably from the Intellectual Property Office, so at the UPC, that's when we really started doing it as a team. And it was, you know, small groups, you know, 3 or 4 people, I guess mainly from the the technical architecture, enterprise architecture side. With some business knowledge, and then I guess the product owner was there's some really good input from like the product owners of the system. So that's when we really started doing it as a kind of team, and that that was probably about 5 years ago, I guess. Yeah.
I have a question. What type of person or what kind of role is the most difficult to get on board, and why?
I just think it could be anybody, it's just I don't think there's any particular role. I would just say it's random, yeah. And sometimes it just means it may mean you just need to do a session with them first on their own and explain it and kind of get them a bit up to speed, and then they'll be more happy and comfortable joining sessions. And sometimes people just come and they listen for the first two and then they join in later. And I think sometimes it's just you do have to spend, I would say the first session you'd probably do at least 2 hours, because you'll spend at least 30 minutes explaining Wardley mapping and what it is, and it's guaranteed that every single session after that you'll spend the first 15 minutes explaining something else or something different, or someone else will join the team. It's there'll be new people joining and you'll have to go through it. So I think
So we have a question coming in from the audience, which is about mapping, top down or bottom up. What's the best way? That's open to everyone.
We tend to just, whoever's in the room, start with what, if it's I don't know, if it's the CEO, you'll probably start at the top with some like big goal, but if it's it could be a product manager, it could be discussions about particular features or services. So it just tends to be who's in the room at the time, and you can always expand the map, and you can always go higher, you can go into detail. And I'm a big fan of like the sub maps, because you can always kind of put it in the car park, say, right, there's a sub map for that, we can come back to that, and maybe let's get this in place first, then we can go into the individual create maps from those those components or services. And sometimes you tend to need different people when you get into that level of detail anyway. So yeah.
Danielle, Kim, anything to add to that?
I did like your comment, Mark, about whoever's in the room, because to me that brings out the sense-making aspect. It's the map is just a way to help get the different points of view, and having tools like the parking lot for, let's make a sub map of that one later on. That's actually a really good way to do it.
Danielle? Okay.
A similar point that Kim had just made. Actually, I like the car park. It's a really good idea.
Yeah, fair enough. So I suppose at that point, and I'm looking at the time, gosh, that went so quickly, and we still got more questions to answer. There is on the platform, there's a chat area that people can go and chat in as well. I suppose I should ask, if there were going to be 3 messages to take home from this, what would they be? God, that's a tough one.
So my main point was that that sense-making aspect of it, but it does take a while. I mean, if it was me at session, when I first started trying to understand sense-making, I still wouldn't know what it was, and it has taken me over time to grow into the term and to grow comfortable with the term. So be aware that it's there and be comfortable with the journey that you take to understand it.
Thank you, Kim. Mark, Danielle?
I would say don't be afraid to tweak and adapt the model and the currency that you might use to get your foot on the ladder and start to create the map. Don't slavishly work to what's published already. You'll be able to get there eventually.
Wonderful, thank you. Mark?
I would just say don't expect to create a perfect map in the sessions, and don't expect the map to change your organization. You know, there's a lot of, you know, just creating a map is one thing, but actually, you know, what you do next is probably the difficult bit. Yeah, so you still have to, you know, socialize it, influence people, you know, because the people in the room will get it, but, you know, the rest of the organization won't. So you know, you may create a fantastic map. Don't get upset if people don't understand it and they don't implement what you've put in the map.
So the map just shows you the landscape. It doesn't tell you, or shows you an idea of the landscape.
Yeah.
It doesn't tell you what to do.
Yeah.
That still requires thought.
Yeah.
Awesome, fantastic. Well, look, wonderful conversations. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm sure there are so many questions, and just shows my weakness as moderation. We're not going to have a chance of getting through them all. I am sure if you go onto the platform in the chat, that people will just want to ask you things. And one of the big ones is people have asked, can we get slides? Are you okay to share the slides? Wonderful. And I couldn't ask for a better start to Map Camp. Thank you so much for all coming and coming along and speaking. Enjoy the rest of Map Camp. And so that's a big thank you from me to all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.